Okay, hi everybody. Again, welcome to our student cafe. The student cafes are virtual events organized by the SEB Student Committee to provide professional development and networking opportunities for the student membership of the Society for Ethnobotany. Um, as we all know, ethnobotany is a field where people kind of end up in um, different pockets of different areas. And so for our students, we want to provide them good, concrete examples of people that are in this career field and um, what they might do in the realm of ethnobotany and how they got there. And I also want to take this moment to encourage all of any student in the audience who isn't a member of the SEB to sign up and become a member. Um, I think the membership fee is about $35 for the year. A lot of benefits come with that, including the ability to apply for funding from the society, the ability to contribute to society writings and to be featured, the ability to submit to our journal, and to come to the conference and apply for conference funding. Um, Speaking of conferences, I also want to announce that our 2026 annual conference will be in Montpellier, France, next summer. So get excited and hope to see a lot of you there as well. Um, Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for this event. It's my pleasure to introduce you all to Abby Snyder. She is the founder of the AgroForest Project, and her work integrates ethnobotanical knowledge with restoration and supply chain sustainability. With experience spanning Fortune 500 sustainability work, Peace Corps, agroforestry, and carbon market leadership, she advances regenerative agricultural systems that honor cultural context and support a climate-smart future. And if that doesn't get you excited to hear what she has to say, I don't know what will. I'm so interested to hear about your work. Abby, thank you for joining us.
Great. Yeah. Hi, everyone. And yeah, thank you for having me here at the SEB Student Cafe. As Savannah mentioned, my name is Abby Snyder, and I'm really excited to talk with you about the AgroForest Project and really dig in and discuss an approach for more effectively capturing the cultural benefits of natural systems within sustainability frameworks and standards. So I'm going to share my screen. I have presentation to walk you all through, and then we'll open it up for questions. Okay, can you all see that? Great, all right. Okay, so just to get started, to give you a bit of context about where I'm coming from. So as a whole, my background is in ecology and agroforestry and climate mitigation. So I'm coming from those fields and then stepping into the field of ethnobotany in order to weave this fascinating discipline into my work. And on the slide here, some of the key moments in my career that have shaped who I am and my professional trajectory have certainly been my work on the ground as a Fulbright Fellow in Indonesia, and then also as a Peace Corps volunteer in Togo, both of which included an essential element of working directly with communities and designing projects within the context of people or cultural systems, right? And then it was during my time at Yale that I really began to incorporate the business strategy and perspective into my environmental science and ecology background. So it was at Yale that I studied both corporate sustainability and conducted field research on soil carbon sequestration in agroforestry systems. So it was really the beginning of like linking these two worlds as to what some call environmental sustainability. And then for the majority of my professional career, I have been working in various roles within the context of sustainability, most of which have focused on working in agricultural systems and driving sustainability efforts alongside multinational food and beverage companies. And then related to that work on the left side of the slide here are a few of my publications in that space, again, mostly relating to greenhouse gas accounting and decarbonization of agricultural supply chains. And then finally, where I am now and where we are today in this talk is how all of this is coming together to shape a new effort called the AgroForest Project, which seeks to bridge ethnobotany and ecosystem service frameworks into the realm of climate mitigation and corporate sustainability. So today I'm going to kind of take you through three main areas. So first, we're going to set some context. So I'll walk you through a few slides that really define what ecosystem services are, what we mean by payments for ecosystem services, and then we'll talk about corporate sustainability to really set the context that we're operating within. And then we'll talk about the gap. So what I've indicated is what's missing in current standards and how this relates to ethnobotany and cultural plant use. And then finally, the approach. So I'll talk you through a case study that demonstrates how we might address this gap in practice. Okay, so setting some context, let's talk about ecosystem services, what they are, why do they matter, and how does this connect to sustainability and ethnobotany. So the concept of ecosystem services, it really emerged, I'm sure y'all are aware of it, from this framework called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. And it was this groundbreaking global scientific initiative to essentially assess the consequences of ecosystem change and its impacts on human well-being on a planetary scale. And this assessment, for the first time, gave us the framework that organizes the benefits people obtain from our planet into 4 categories. So starting with the first category here on the slide, supporting services. So these are really services that form the foundation that makes all other services possible. So this is like, yeah, soil formation, photosynthesis, nutrient cycling. So we as humans don't necessarily directly benefit, say, from soil formation, but indirectly, these functions allow us to procure all the other services, like regulating services. So these are the services that really work, I would say, behind the scenes to maintain our planet's life-supporting systems. So controlling the climate, managing floods, regulating disease, purifying our water. And then provisioning services, these provide us with the tangible goods that we all know and love. So food, water, timber, fiber, right? These are the raw materials that sustain our daily lives. And then we have cultural services, and these enrich our lives through recreation, aesthetic beauty, spiritual fulfillment, social gathering, and functions. And I think what's really interesting or important to think about when talking about these services, and it's something that the assessment really gets at, is that the human species, while we're relatively buffered against environmental changes to a degree, I think we're bumping up against that now, but to a degree, we are ultimately fully dependent on the flow of these ecosystem services. So in a way, you can think of the realm of sustainability as an effort to maintain the health and functioning of these systems for human well-being. And sustainability is a broad field, and there's many different ways to define it. But one way that sustainability attempts to safeguard these services is through the concept of payments for ecosystem services, which I'll talk about on the next slide. I'll also note too that when I go through this deck, when I talk about cultural ecosystem services, I'm referencing services procured from the local environment that hold cultural relevance. So this is a bit of a blurring of the lines of this categorization, because I really see it as it could be provisioning and it could be culture, right? It could be food and fiber, as well as spiritual and aesthetic sources. So when I say cultural ecosystem services, I'm referring to that collectively. Okay, so let's talk about what are payments for ecosystem services. Before that, get into that, I just want to say, first, that as a nature lover myself, I truly believe that you can't put a price on nature. And this quote really gets at it best, that nature cannot be monetized, but the services that people derive from it can. And efforts to enhance these services can be supported by economic incentives. And I really couldn't agree with that more, right? There's no way to monetize or economically value what it's like to experience a shooting star. Or I recently just came back from a camping trip and I listened to owls, call all night. And there's just really no way to put a price on that. It's too personal, it's too subjective. However, by internalizing these ecosystem services within the market the best that we can begin to direct financing and cash flow toward protecting or enhancing them. And so this insight really captures like the essence of payments for ecosystem services, or PES, and that market-based mechanisms, another word for PES, lots of jargon here, are designed to internalize ecosystem services that would typically sit outside of normal market transactions. So in economics, this is called, a positive externality. So beneficial impacts that the current market system isn't capturing, but they're occurring regardless, right? And one of the core problems that the assessment indicated is that because these ecosystem services are not captured in our markets, markets fail to provide the appropriate signals for their sustainable use. So PES works by monetizing these ecosystem service assets. And the most common example we have, which I'm sure y'all are familiar with or aware of, is carbon credits, right? That's where we have monetized 1 ton of carbon that has been reduced or removed, and then that unit is transacted on a marketplace to financially incentivize climate mitigation actions. And then the last point I want to make on this slide, which is like really fundamental, is that market mechanisms can only work effectively when supporting institutions are in place. So you need monitoring systems, standards, transparent governance structures, right? Like in order to create a fungible unit, we need to be able to all collectively define and agree what constitutes that unit. So the presence of these supporting frameworks and standards is really important for their success. And so currently in the space, this is how it's played out. The majority of PES frameworks have focused on regulating services in the form of carbon credits for climate change mitigation and biodiversity credits. They're emerging as almost like it's like a multi-benefit tool, I would say. It targets supporting services that underpin several other ecosystem services simultaneously. But cultural services, they've largely been absent from these frameworks. And this brings me to a quote that we only see what we know. And the question that I'm exploring in my work with the AgroForest Project is, can we expand what we see to include cultural ecosystem services in frameworks that govern the design of nature-based solutions? Okay, so just a bit more context. So why does this matter for corporate sustainability? And then what is the connection between ecosystem services, payments for ecosystem services, and sustainability? And the short answer is that companies are using these market-based mechanisms as they take climate action, and they're doing that through existing frameworks. So we're going to talk about how they're taking that climate action and what frameworks they're working with. So yeah, previously when I just mentioned that market-based mechanisms, or PES, can only work effectively when supporting institutions are in place. Here is a high-level overview of the landscape for those institutions in carbon. And all of these actors play a role in ensuring that that 1 ton of carbon reduced or removed has actually occurred atmospherically and has market value. And so you have players at the bottom of the diagram that are focused on the data collection, and then those actors that monitor and verify that data, And then just above that are project developers. So this is where I would say categorically where the AgroForest Project comes into play. And essentially, these are the actors of the orgs that design and implement projects on the ground. And then above that, this is where you get into the standards and reporting frameworks that write those rules for what constitutes a ton of carbon reduced or removed. And as we move to this presentation, this is the space that I'm hoping to influence to begin including cultural services within the current standards and frameworks and protocols. Okay, so focusing on corporate climate mitigation, the what. So, all those actors we just looked at on the prior slide are engaging in this space because there is significant demand for credible climate or carbon outcomes. And so we're witnessing this wave of corporate climate commitments, even with the current environmental policy reductions and political climate. As of this year, around over 7,500 organizations have made a validated public promise to reduce their carbon emissions. And what we're seeing is that this momentum is only accelerating. So the number of companies making these commitments grew over 200% between the end of 2023 and 2025. And then another really important piece to point out is that food and beverage companies, which is the majority of where my work has resided, the predominant amount of their emissions reside in what we call scope 3. And this is basically the sourcing of raw commodities like cacao, coffee, wheat, right? Like all the raw elements that go into our food system. And these aren't just vague promises to be more sustainable. These companies are committing to a carbon framework called the Science Based Target Initiative. And specifically, that initiative requires that they commit to limit global warming to a 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario, which approximately, and this is the graph on the right, requires a 90% reduction in total emissions by 2025. And so my take is that these commitments represent significant financial resources flowing toward landscape level interventions in nature-based projects. Okay, so this is the how. So, how are food and beverage companies actually implementing this? How are they keeping good on their climate commitments? And looking at this landscape diagram, we can see there's kind of three main categories or types of nature-based interventions. And numbers 1 and 2 refer to agroforestry and regenerative agriculture. And these are classified as value chain interventions or insets because they happen within the company's supply chain. They're directly connected to the products that that company sources. And again, this is scope 3. This is where the majority of emissions reside. And then number 3 is forest conservation. So that would fall outside of a company's supply chain. And that refers more often to a carbon credit. And it's not directly connected to the value chain or a product that they're sourcing, but it is a credit that they can purchase to claim against a public target. And so in many cases, these interventions or projects are happening in places where communities have deep cultural relationships with the land and with plants and natural systems. And then the same thing with biodiversity, right? So this is another space that's emerging. And we're seeing that, over 160 companies are preparing for nature-based targets. Over 400 organizations represent nearly 16 trillion in assets that have adopted these nature-related disclosure recommendations. And so again, there's this trend of momentum building with companies reporting biodiversity outcomes increasing by 43% in 2024. And so to me, this again represents this fundamental shift in how companies think about and act on their impacts related to natural systems. So they're moving beyond carbon to consider a more broad, holistic spectrum of ecosystem services. And then same diagram, but now in the biodiversity context, we see the same, the same landscape, but different intervention categories. So agroforestry and regen ag would now be framed as sustainable sourcing within the value chain. And then forest conservation becomes habitat protection. And we see the addition of afforestation and reforestation as ecosystem restoration. So, companies are recognizing that they need to address multiple environmental challenges simultaneously. And that's creating demand for a more holistic framework that delivers beyond climate, beyond carbon, and includes biodiversity and potentially social or cultural outcomes. And this brings us back to the why. So, I think this quote, in my opinion, was a good way to kind of sum up why are companies wanting to follow these frameworks, and it really comes back to the fact that their outcomes, they want their outcomes to mean something, right? They want their outcomes to be backed by science, to be measured, to be quantifiable, for there to be a clear KPI associated with that outcome, and in some cases monetized and traded. So they are looking to frameworks and standards to bring that credibility. And so you're seeing major brands like Patagonia, Ben & Jerry's, 7th Gen making these commitments because they recognize that credible science-based frameworks provide the legitimacy they need with investors, consumers, regulators. So again, just underscoring here the role that standards play in both facilitating the action and financing of efforts to conserve ecosystem services. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about standards and frameworks, but let's just pause a moment to talk about who they are and what they do. And so standard setting organizations, and I have some logos down there at the bottom of some of the big ones. To me, they serve really 3 fundamental functions for managing and regulating ecosystem services. So the first is that, they are the rule makers, right? So these bodies, they develop technical methodologies and standards for measuring these environmental impacts and their benefits. So they describe in detail the eligibility criteria for projects, the appropriate quantification approach, the requirements to ensure that local communities are engaged and there's stakeholder engagement processes in place, right? They're ultimately the rule book by which a carbon or biodiversity project is verified and validated against, which is really important. And then quality assurance. So basically they maintain market integrity over time. So these organizations, they establish and update their standards over time based on scientific developments and market feedback. So basically ensuring that there's a element of continuous improvement so that the system continues to evolve with our scientific understanding. And they also accredit third-party validators who assess projects on the ground to ensure there's independent oversight, that is part of the project quality, right? So, and then finally, they provide the infrastructure to make these transactions possible. So particularly in carbon credits, these standard setting bodies maintain registries that track and issue and retire these environmental credits that really create the transparency and accountability that markets need to function. So these standard setting bodies, they provide exactly the infrastructure necessary in order to internalize these ecosystem services into our economic system, into our market. Okay, so that's the context. So now we're going to talk about the gap. So, as we just talked about, current nature-based solutions and the supporting standards, they guide the development of carbon and biodiversity outcomes primarily, but do they capture cultural ecosystem services that we all know are inherent in these landscapes and valuable within natural systems? So to understand the current landscape, I did an analysis of 16 major carbon and biodiversity standards to assess how they currently capture or don't capture cultural ecosystem services. So I really looked at two key indicators that reveal different pathways for cultural integration, I would say. So the first dimension examines or looks at community engagement and social safeguards. So this is basically, how are these standards establishing and governing the process by which affected communities participate in project design and implementation? So this would be the extent to which local stakeholders have decision-making power. There's formal representation and, protection from any negative social impacts that would occur throughout the project lifecycle. And I would also say, like, this isn't a direct indicator of including cultural ecosystem services in the standard explicitly, but in my point of view, it is an indicator of, I would say, almost like institutional openness to community-centered governance and recognition of cultural values. So to me, it represents a foundation and possible opening for integrating cultural outcomes. And then the second indicator looks explicitly at cultural ecosystem services and their assessment. So whether and how standards recognize, measure, protect, and enhance the cultural benefits of these systems and what they provide to local communities, including, the integration of culturally significant plant species into the methodology. And so you can see from the metrics framework, integration of either of these two elements range from minimal, so no recognition of cultural services or social safeguards, and then all the way to strong. So where cultural services and social safeguards are fully integrated into the methodology and standard, and they are weighted equally among other biophysical metrics like carbon, for example. Okay, and so the results. So on community engagement, I found that 75% of the standards are reviewed indicated as having moderate to strong ratings, right? So this tells me that the sector has largely figured out how to establish consultation processes, conduct stakeholder participation, and include social safeguarding mechanisms. So what I take from that is that social safeguards, thankfully, are increasingly becoming the norm among carbon and biodiversity standards. So it's encouraging that that infrastructure is there. These processes exist, right? So most standards know and require how to bring communities into the conversation. But the cultural ecosystem services tells a different story, right? So here we see that 88% of the standards received, limited or minimal ratings for incorporating processes to safeguard cultural services. And more pointed is that 0 standards provided basically like operational protocols for integrating cultural services, despite acknowledging their importance in some of the standards. So in my view is that even though standards are getting better at consultation processes, they currently lack frameworks for operationalizing the cultural insights that they gather. Okay, so the gap. While community engagement is reasonably well addressed, there's a gap when it comes to actually integrating cultural services into project design and implementation. So how can we manage landscapes for cultural ecosystem services? And the opportunity, so in my point of view, this represents an incredible opportunity to develop a cultural ecosystem services framework and address this missing link in existing standards. So I think a framework of this kind could be truly transformative in restoration, afforestation, and sustainable agricultural initiatives. I think across carbon credits, to supply chain insets, to international development programs, by having an established approach as to how we can integrate cultural services alongside other measured outcomes like carbon and biodiversity. And I think by integrating and internalizing cultural services, we can drive financing toward these benefits that are already occurring on the ground. They're already there. And I think there's definitely a fair amount to figure out here, but from my perspective, a framework like this could be really beneficial in safeguarding local plant knowledge. So as the world increasingly loses more of its biodiversity, so does the plant knowledge that often lives alongside it. So this could be an opportunity to safeguard both in a single system. There's also an opportunity to center the cultural context of natural systems really at the heart of project design, so that the projects are created in a way that is truly as diverse as the people that interact and manage that system. So really thinking about how do we perhaps orient project design toward the people component. And then operationally, from a market perspective, as I just mentioned a second ago, is that this would allow us to capture multiple ecosystem services simultaneously, right? So carbon and biodiversity alongside culture. And so this multi-benefit approach could potentially increase the value and funnel more financial resources towards projects of this kind. And then finally, contextualizing nature-based projects within the cultural dimension could potentially enhance project durability and longevity, given that there could be perceived greater value and buy-in from the local community if cultural services are elevated and intentionally integrated. So as a whole, I really see this as like an opportunity to redefine nature-based solutions and bring the cultural element to the forefront to ensure that, you know, as we have this global push for reforestation and afforestation and crediting projects and inset projects, they can become a vehicle for cultural resilience. Okay, so how could we possibly get there? This concept is very much still in development, but to help illustrate the idea and approach, I have a case study that I'll share with you as to how this could be developed and tested. And I'm actually going to Togo, where this case study is based, next week to test out this approach. So this is all very well aligned as far as timing. Okay, so the first part, like, you know, how can we operationalize cultural services within existing market structures and standards? And I as of now, kind of see 3 different pathways where this could be possible. So the first could be, you know, the project could be developed with the intention to primarily reduce and sequester carbon. So the primary ecosystem service could be carbon, and the list of possible plant species selected would be initially selected for their carbon sequestration potential. But then secondarily, the refinement of that plant list could be considered through the lens of community cultural application and use. So almost as like a secondary screen to ensure that that plant list and the plant selected for that project not only store carbon, but also have utility and relevance to that local community. And then another option is that the project could be designed primarily for biodiversity outcomes, and then secondarily informed by the cultural relevance of plant species to direct that final list of plants for the project. And then finally, a project could be designed entirely for cultural ecosystem services as the primary outcome, and then secondarily for carbon storage and biodiversity as additional outcomes that could be quantified within the same system. And so the approach of the case study and the pilot project takes the form of this last approach, right? So we're looking at how to center culturally relevant plants exclusively. Okay, so the case study and the pilot project. So the project is located in the maritime region of Togo, West Africa. And we've been working here with an agroforestry site that we established in 2009. So we've been working there for over a decade. So in 2009 to 2011, we established that an 800 nitrogen fixing tree agroforestry system in collaboration with the local middle school. And then from 2011 to 2015, community leaders maintained the site, and it was used as a demonstration site for Peace Corps volunteers. And then I returned in 2018 to assess the carbon storage potential of that site as part of my graduate school research. And then today, next week, and after next week, but starting next week, we're looking at to build, on this existing site by incorporating culturally relevant plant species, using a food forest model where different plants fill out the various strata. So the existing Albizia trees have, they're great. They're pioneer species. They've significantly improved the soil conditions through nitrogen fixation, organic matter addition, reduced erosion, right? So the system is in a much better place to biophysically incorporate additional plant species that are less tolerant to the challenging conditions that the site was once in. And so the first step, how we're doing this, so we developed a comprehensive list of 440 plant species and evaluated their suitability for inclusion in the existing system. So basically, we needed to ensure that the plants could survive and thrive in that specific site. And so we evaluated each species across multiple biophysical criteria listed here, and some non-biophysical too. We also looked at its conservation status as well. And then the second step involved validating and refining our species selection through consultation with local experts. So I connected with local agronomists, a lot of my friends in the community of Zafi that are familiar with the regional growing conditions and understand which species would be most likely to establish successfully in the site. And so through that process, we narrowed our initial list of 40 species down to the 20 most appropriate plants for that site in that local context. And I just picked these visual instruments up today, actually at the print shop. So super excited. But step 3 focused on creating these visual and descriptive materials for our final 20 plant species. So because we didn't have the time and space to collect real plants and press them, we decided we're going to create visual materials that could be used to help identify in the community their cultural uses. So each plant profile included botanical illustration, local names, scientific names, common names, photographs, and key identifying features. And then on the back of each of these, we have all of its characteristics to aid in identifying and understanding these plants. And so, yeah, using these visual materials, we're going to conduct a one-day workshop to train community members as ethnobotanical co-researchers. So the training will cover, species identification using our visual aids, the survey methodology for documenting uses within the community, and an overview where each 2-person team will be interviewing 5 people in the community for 3 assigned plant species. And so we're going to practice the data collection process through some role playing and hands-on trading to ensure that everyone feels comfortable and can go off and collect some data in a participatory model. And then, so the trained community members, these research teams, they'll go out into the community to document the various uses and frequency of use patterns for these 20 plant species. So the interview process will collect data on the plants, medicinal, all different types of cultural uses, medicinal, food, material, ceremonial. And the teams will document the specific preparation methods, the plant parts, and the preparation techniques. And then the frequency of any of the identified plants will also be identified from a range of daily to seasonal patterns, just to understand the relative degree of use and harvesting levels. And the whole intention of designing this is definitely to be participatory and community-led data collection, but it's also meant to be simple and easily replicated. So the idea is that after this initial training, the materials could be repurposed for future workshops to collect plant data. And then the final step will involve analyzing the collected data to determine, what plants will be integrated into the existing system. So the analysis will review plants with the greatest number of uses and then frequency of use to determine which species are most culturally significant in the community, and also which would most effectively complement the system and can be integrated into different strata, occupying the canopy or the vine or herbaceous or ground cover layer. So my thinking is that based on that data analysis and the system and the fact this is a pilot, I would imagine a maximum of 2 to 3 species will be selected for integration into the existing system. But we'll see what's possible once we finalize and collect that data. And then, the outcome. So the outcome is multifaceted. This is a new concept. So I think first the idea is to develop a demonstration site of a system that prioritizes and centers cultural ecosystem services. And then second, all the data that we collect plus future data is going to be captured in a community managed ethnobotanical guide that will live at the local school that has been partnering with us for the agroforestry site. So this supports both the demonstration site, but then also helps to safeguard local plant knowledge for future generations. And then finally, this can really be the first go at testing a cultural ecosystem services framework, where the potential measured outcomes could be some quantitative number, like cultural use units as an idea, and then secondarily, the total amount of carbon sequestered per year. So just kind of starting to think through what would it mean to develop a framework for cultural systems using this pilot site as an example. And I think, as a whole, as I said, I really see this as a launching pad to redefine and rethink how we can really start to center cultural systems at the heart of nature-based solutions and project design. Okay, that brings us to the end of the presentation. All my contact info is here. Would love to connect with y'all if you have ideas, questions, want to chat about this work. So all different ways to get in touch, and we can open it up for questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Abby. I'd like to start. So the rest of this time is going to be a Q&A with Abby. But I want to open it up to any students in the audience first. So let me see. Yeah, if there are any students who have a question for Abby, maybe do the little hand raise motion. There we go. And Angela, why don't you start?
Hi, Abby, do you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you.
Okay, congratulations for your presentation. I was just wondering about how to engage with communities initially and trying to understand or identify if there is this interest in the community to develop this type of projects. Yeah. what would you advise?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll speak to it from two different perspectives. So the first perspective, I'll speak to it just from my experience working with this community, and then I'll speak at a more high level, like how standard setting bodies engage with communities. So from my perspective, this started as I was living in Togo in a small community called Zafi for 2 years. So I would say the heart of identifying whether or not the community was interested in this project really came from just hanging out and eating fufu and building trust and talking about stuff, which is, I think, always the best way to go about it. You're just that kind of long-term trust building that's required to really kind of generate any idea that's suitable for the context. So that's how this initial initiative came to be. We collectively identified this agroforestry system, and then having touch points where I was going back and maintaining that trust, maintaining that relationship. And it was actually through WhatsApp, because obviously I live in the US, they're in Togo. Like, I can't get over to Togo all the time and have heart-to-heart conversations under the mango tree eating fufu. So thank goodness for technology. And a lot of this project development was just brainstorming over WhatsApp and kind of co-creating it together. So that's how this project came to be. From the perspective of like standard setting bodies, that one slide I had that showed all the different actors involved in this space. It's so, if there's a identified interest in developing a carbon credit project, it would really be the project developers that would go on the ground and identify interest from that community in creating a carbon credit or biodiversity project. And inherently there's some power dynamics at play there that I think are true anytime you bring financing or money into these systems. And so that's where over time we've seen, especially carbon credit standards, increasingly incorporating governance around social safeguards so that it's required. And what I mean by required is like the third-party auditor will verify that it's occurred, that the project developers are engaging with the community and conducting stakeholder engagement, and there are like public consultation opportunities and benefit sharing, transparency, and things like that. So those are the two kind of perspectives I can share from my vantage point.
Thank you.
Okay, any other students have any questions for Abby?
I had a question about soil, but I'm not a student. Is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead, Trish.
I'm in a project that I'm doing a lot of agroforestry systems down in South America, and I'm trying to see the effect of either intercropping or plants on the trees themselves. Are there specific soil sampling techniques that you would suggest to look at the actives, chemistry, or just general growth patterns?
Yeah, definitely. So I would start, oh my gosh, I'm going to blank on the name of this protocol. I feel like it was C4. They have a soil sampling. So I'd start with like identifying how you could, if you want statistical significance and accuracy, developing like a soil sampling plan, because soil carbon is funny. It's not, it's incredibly heterogeneous. So you want to come up with like a soil sampling plan that could effectively capture the soil carbon of the entire site. And then the most like straightforward but expensive approach is doing soil core sampling. So based on that soil sampling approach, you would collect soil cores from the site and then submit it to a laboratory for dry combustion analysis, and that will give you the most precise soil carbon outcome. But it's expensive and time consuming, and also when you're trying to get soil from outside the US into the US, it's really cumbersome. So there are like other models that you can use. So Comet Farm is a model that you could apply. There's Cool Farm Tool is a model, not as accurate, but you don't have to collect direct soil samples. So I'd look at those two. Those two are the most, I would say, publicly available, ease of use. Comet Planner is the third. It's sort of like the baby step to Comet Farm. So that's the advice I would give.
And but if it's if I do soil samples, I want more than pH and macronutrients. I'm wondering about, what other plants might be adding components that would favor the growth of the plant or the the biologically active components. So I was thinking, besides just general soil samples, I know there are soil kits. DNA, environmental DNA is a little expensive. I can't really afford this on the size of this project, but I'll look at
Yeah.
those. You said
Yeah.
Comet Planner, and what was the other farm? I mean, and one was,
Yeah. Comet Plar Comet Planner, Comet Farm,
oh,
and Cool Farm Tool.
okay.
Comet Planner and Comet Farm are more North American based. They were initially funded by the USDA and in collaboration with a few universities. And then Cool Farm Tool is more European focused, but applicable global.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
We have a question from Maria, who's a grad student in Arkansas right now. She says, "Thank you, Abby, for the presentation. According to your experience, what are common barriers for building cultural awareness for implementing agroforestry systems in lands where monoculture is predominant?"
Yeah, I think one of the most significant barriers comes back to the cultural ecosystem services is if you're going to be integrating like say trees into a monoculture site to create like an agroforestry system, that tree should have some use or utility for the community. And, in my experience, I started a lot of projects in the Peace Corps that failed. And I would say a lot of that is because they weren't culturally connected. So for example, I worked a lot with moringa, and moringa is great for a lot of reasons. It has incredible nutrient benefits. It works in bad soils, but it wasn't part of the local cuisine, so it didn't really take off, even though it checked a lot of boxes. But when we designed this agroforestry site, we selected Albizia as the predominant species to incorporate, and the community had use of these trees. We coppice the trees every year, and the community uses those limbs for fuel wood. And so because of that direct connection to that community, that system and that project lived outside of actually any additional funding or support. It just was maintained by the community because they identified its utility and its use because those trees had relevance in the community.
Maria, did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much.
I had a question about like the kind of the big picture, like the end product here. So like, are you envisioning a possibility where like a corporation, instead of like purchasing a carbon credit or planting some trees in some forest somewhere, like instead could invest in like a specific community, like a purchase a credit, which is like an investment in a specific community, and have that act as like a carbon credit, or like a what did you say, a
Yeah. Yeah, all these
PES?
terms, all this jargon, PES, market-based mechanism, carbon credit. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that would be the ultimate end goal where, I do think I think carbon is like the driving force right now, for a lot of reasons. And it's the most sophisticated market-based mechanism that we have. And so I would imagine, I think the end goal would be to develop a cultural ecosystem services framework that could be applied alongside a carbon crediting standard as almost like an add-on, as, okay, you're going to do this carbon credit project. If you want to claim, another jargon, a co-benefit associated with this project, we're going to measure the cultural uses of this system as well. So, and I don't see it being like, carbon credits and carbon outcomes are reported against targets, I would initially see, you know, cultural ecosystem services not reporting against a target, but perhaps more of like a narrative claim that a company would make about their effort. You know, we invested so much money, and as a result, we sequestered 100 tons of carbon annually and safeguarded, you know, 32 different uses of the plant species we selected, something like that.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for answering that. We have a question from Anthony, who is originally from Ghana, but currently a grad student at Clark University. Anthony, if you want to go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, Abby, thank you very much for your presentation. In fact, I really enjoyed it. And then I have a lot of experience with respect to agroforestry because I was working with Barry Caribot, which is a cocoa company, and then also do more of agroforestry. Yeah, and then sustainability. I was then environmental sustainability manager for 6 years before moving to Canada, then now in US. So I have a question. And my question goes, I know Togo share boundary with Ghana. So I don't know whether you had a chance to go to Ghana.
I
So
have,
my
I
question
visited,
is,
but I need to spend more time there. Yeah.
oh, okay, good. That's good. So I have a big headache now with respect to my country when it comes to mining and then the way we are destroying the forest because I am more environmentalist and then climate change activist. So look at how people are mining, then we are creating a lot of chaos in terms of land devastation. It's really hurting. And it's really, really one of my headache now as a student, as an environmentalist, and then as a being, because it's our job to ensure that the land or the planet is being safe for the next generation. So I'm always trying to find a way to develop a model in which we can use to help most of the vast land destroyed in my country so that I can also get an actors along with me and find a way to bring it back to life again. So my question is, what kind of model do you suggest in terms of agroforestry system designing? And I don't know whether you have much knowledge about how Ghana land is being destroyed because of all this mining thing. It's good to get gold, but then you're going to get gold. It should be more environmentally responsible. But that's not what we are doing. And it's my headache. I can't sleep. I always dream. I say, what is happening in my country? I wish I can go back and have the power to do everything and then put a whole place in a beautiful state. But I cannot do it alone. And I'm trying to design a model. So I keep trying to so I was thinking about last week, I'll just gather some guys and I was just talking about it that, okay, fine. For me to overcome an impossible war, I need to be a leader. And I need guys around me to also be a leader. So I was trying to have my leadership model in place, get my team on board, train them to be more leader, have that leadership conscience in their mind so that impossible war that we have created now, we can find a way to solve it. So I'm looking for a way or the design and the model that would be more appropriate because I was a sustainability environmental for their company. What we were doing, we were planting a lot of trees. I planted more than 1 million trees within my 6 years working with them before I resigned and then came to Canada, then over here. So I'm still going to go back and find a way all the mess that we have created. Maybe I wasn't part, but my friend, my uncle, whoever did it, we're still going to suffer the same kind of mess. So that's my challenge
Wow.
now. And in fact, I really love your presentation and everything. And I love the fact that it's also from you did it from West Africa. And then that's great. That's fantastic.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited to eat some fufu next week. That's Anthony, that's such a good question. And also, I think our worlds may have overlapped because when I was at SustainCERT, I was working with Barry Calvo on designing an agroforestry project in Cote d'Ivoire. I don't know if that was maybe in 2021, something like that. But that's so cool that you've been working with them and you really get the stuff that I'm talking about. I don't know if I have an answer to your question. Although the first thing that kind of came to mind is I really think about multifunctionality of systems. And so although the food forest model is a really challenging one to implement for all the reasons, the maintenance, the complexity, I do think when you can have multiple benefits and multiple uses, it's almost like density of functionality within a system. I think that's something I'm really intrigued by, and something that we're working to develop in Togo. So, but yeah, let's connect. I feel like there's a lot of overlap between our worlds.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, great.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I
Yeah,
appreciate it.
thank you.
We have a question from Inga. I don't know how much time you have left, Abby. So we're at
Yeah,
2:05.
I can
Do
stay
you?
on. I can stay on for
Okay.
another 5 minutes if that works for y'all.
Yeah. Um, so Inga asks, I don't know the topic in depth, but I know carbon credits in general can be very problematic and sometimes ineffective. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think agroforestry projects avoid these problems?
Hmm. Yeah. So first, I want to say that's true, right? Like, it's not a perfect system. There are bad actors. Um, and carbon is really meaning our like collectively first go at trying to like internalize an ecosystem service into the market. And there's going to be gaps and holes and power dynamics and challenges like along the way. And so I worked at Verra prior, right? And yeah, and Verra was in the news for a lot of these issues of like the carbon outcome not really being there. And I think that critique is welcomed. You know what I mean? That's, I think, how these standards get better, how they increase their monitoring and verification requirements to ensure that the trees are actually there, and how they continue to, enhance and require social safeguards in their design. And I've noticed too, like not outside of carbon credits, but when I was talking, that one slide I had where I am seeing there's a trend in more standards incorporating social safeguards. So to me, that's a good indicator of a positive reaction to the negative press that some of these approaches have received. Because I'm even seeing in like inventory accounting, like greenhouse gas protocol and SBTI flag, it's not required, but there is a suggested, so still somewhere to go here, suggested approach of engaging communities in these designs. So I think that's a really important question, and one that needs to continue to be addressed in this work for sure.
Thanks, Abby.
Yeah.
Daphne is raising her hand. Daphne, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Abby, for your presentation. I was curious how, in a project like the one that you're working on right now, you balance the ecological benefits of something like carbon sequestration with the benefit to the community of having access to these culturally relevant plants that I'm assuming they're using for things like food or fuel or medicine. I'm curious about that balance, and so that like one doesn't compromise the other. And then I'm wondering who is part of the decision making and management of the forest to determine like what is considered a sustainable harvesting of those products from culturally relevant plants.
Such a good question, and one that like we're gonna have to figure out, because you're right. Like, yeah, if there's even the fuel wood, so the current system with these albizia trees, they're coppiced every year, and that fuel wood is burned, right? So when in 2018, when I was doing that carbon sequestration analysis, that had to be taken into account, that obviously that carbon is now lost to the atmosphere. So I think that's a real consideration, and why in our survey forms we're trying to identify frequency of use to just get a sense of what the take from the system will be. And it's definitely something we'll have to manage and think about with that final selection of species. And then as far as like who's managing this forest, so that the land is owned by the local middle school. And so they are ultimately the final decision makers of what is done with that space. And the teachers, it's an interesting setup. It's almost like a benefit of being a teacher there. You can harvest and use like the that land as you please. So, but the community members also use it too. But I would say the final decision making comes from the teachers in the school as to how that land is used.
I'm sorry to burst in there, but I think doing sustainable harvest studies is a great topic. There aren't that many. It's species specific, and I encourage all the students to really look into that if this is an area of interest, because we really need more of that so people know what they can harvest and how much. So thanks for just letting me speak a moment.
All right, Oliver, do you want to go ask your question?
Thank you. Thank you for speaking, Abby. Your project sounds really phenomenal, and I wish all the best. I know it can feel a little uncertain in the early days of sort of getting the actual things in the ground. I'm working on a very different project, but similar in that I'm doing a lot of local plant survey studies to sort of find out what is existing.
Oh, I think you're on mute now.
And I was wondering, do you have any sort of are y'all going to be sort of contributing the survey work that you're doing to sort of more broad plant population information, and if so, where? And additionally, if you know of any resources for sort of up to date like sort of very site specific studies, like the data you're gathering, if you have any resources you could point me to.
Such a good question. I almost would have asked that to the group because I don't know. I want to also connect to these resources, and would love if the project could connect to something more global. Yeah. So does anyone in the group have a suggestion for that?
It's all right if not. I actually I'm trying to do basically urban landscaping, but xeriscaping. I'm located in New York City, and I live in the biggest city in the world. How is there no local data on what grows in this eco zone that isn't sort of invasive? And I haven't found anything, but I'm also trying to pull in a lot of community engagement because it is important that it's culturally engaged. And it sounds like you have really sort of opened yourself up to a new cultural experience in a new place. So the cultural context is a bit different, but what are those sort of, I imagine that there's a lot of third space sort of events you're doing with the community in order to sort of build that social capital, establish yourself as someone who's trustworthy, and also get input that is actual input, as opposed to just oh, I like this or I don't like this, but actually this is something I would like to do and join and be a part of. What sort of events have you done, or social gatherings for your project to get communities to sort of feel like they're really a part of the governing body of the process?
Yeah, I love that question. So in the context of Togo, what I've learned just from being there on the ground is that having parties is a really great way to get people involved. And so even this project we're going to do next week, we're leading the workshop, and then the community goes out and collects data, and then the last day we're going to have a big fete, which is French for party, and with lots of good food and music and celebration. I think to just continue to enhance that trust, make it fun. I love the use of third spaces, so yeah, that, and I think it's always so unique to the cultural context that you're operating within. But what I've learned from my counterparts and mentors in Togo is, yeah, some good fufu, some good dancing after some workshop stuff is always a good way to build those social ties and that trust, so that we can, because this is certainly going to evolve. I have no idea what we're going to learn when we go out there, and how we're going to have to tweak it the next time around. So those gatherings to me have always resulted in great conversations, or the fodder you need for a conversation down the road to be like, what didn't work? What didn't you like? So yeah, I think it's always very much worth investing in that piece of this work. Definitely.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question.
Okay, thanks everybody. I think we're gonna have to end it there, just for time purposes. But thank you everybody for joining. Thank you, Abby, for sharing your work with us, and graciously answering all of our questions. Again, I think what you're doing is really fascinating, has a lot of really good power for good, potential for good. And it's refreshing to hear about as someone who is very steeped in academia right now. But yeah, this was a great talk. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. And we'll catch you at the next one. We will be having another one of these next month. So stay tuned for the final details on that. And hopefully you'll be getting those details soon.